Well, thank you very much, Tom. Ladies and gentlemen, can I start by expressing my gratitude to everybody who has participated in this marvellous conference over the last couple of days. Can I hope understandably, express my gratitude to former members of my magnificent staff who've attended and who've made contributions, asked questions and speeches and defended the performance by government. And I was delighted to once again be reminded of the splendid fiscal record of the Howard government by my marvellous treasurer and Australia's longest serving treasurer, Peter Costello, this morning. I very genuinely do thank the participants for both their praise in some cases and their criticisms and rebukes in others. Now, I understand that all of the contributors were asked to include at least 3 negative observations. So I will, in the spirit of the seminar, respond in kind. Now, what are 3 or 4 really major mistakes that I made in the time I was Prime Minister? I think by far the worst was my decision to accept the invitation of the Pakistani army on the mountains of Kashmir to bowl a makeshift cricket ball at some young Pakistanis who were being instructed in the art of that magnificent game, and undoubtedly the second most important deposit of the British Raj. And I know Hugh White said I was an old Empire loyalist. That's a bit of a stretch, but I did appreciate that the other great deposit, of course, being the English language. I'll come to some of the others of the mistakes I made as I moved my way through. I think the division of our time in government between the beginning of 97 and the middle of 2001, namely the Aston by-election, is absolutely appropriate. The Aston by-election was in reality, as well as psychologically, a huge turning point in the fortunes of my government. I didn't regard it as a guarantee that we were going to win, but I think I monkeyed around with that magnificent phrase of Winston Churchill's when he said that this is not the beginning of the end, but it may be the end of the beginning. And I thought Aston was the end of the dog period of 2001. The first 6 months of 2001 were really very difficult. And can I say I'm particularly indebted to John Anderson, who's been with us for most of the 2 days, for doggedly arguing in Cabinet that the public felt that they had been diddled on the GST when it came to the replacement of excise on the impact of the GST on the price of petrol. The technical explanation given to us by the Treasury, economically impeccable, but it didn't quite, I know Dave Alexander is nodding his head, it didn't quite pass the pub test. There was something about efficiency gains. You can't turn that into a grab on talkback radio, efficiency gains. You can do a lot with economic arguments, but we really did have a big problem, but we worked our way through it. And I think the fruits of that effort became apparent in the Aston by-election. Of course, the other memorable thing about the Aston by-election was that I got the result while I watched the Wallabies defeat the British and Irish Lions at ANZ Stadium that night, which was a very enjoyable experience because I had the opportunity of presenting the trophy to the Australian captain, Antonio Riley, that great former centre three-quarter for the Lions, had to appear on the platform with me. But Aston was really a turning point because the Labor Party should have won that by-election. It didn't need a huge swing. and it fell short, and it gave tremendous heart. My view for the record, I know I'm not meant to go beyond the middle of 2001, but my view for the record, particularly in the context of Philippa's contribution, is that I think we'd have just won the 2001 election without the events of the second half. But I think there's no doubt that the greater emphasis on national security following both Tampa and the 11th of September and the events surrounding it added to the level of support that we received. And in this context, I want to draw on something that Stephen Martin mentioned with a rugby league grand final background. It used to be the practice in this country, I think, until Julia Gillard became Prime Minister, that the Prime Minister of the day would present the NRL trophy at the grand final and would go onto the field and do it, and that was always an interesting experience. I'd presented the 1996 trophy in the most appalling of circumstances. I had to present it to Glenn Lazarus, who led the Melbourne Storm, and what was, of course, absolutely painful beyond belief about that was that my team, St George, had led 14-0 at half-time, but had ended up leaving in one of the most... And I've been into a lot of subdued dressing rooms in my time, but without any doubt the most devastating dressing room I've ever been in, even worse than a Queensland dressing room after a defeat by New South Wales, and they're not very common, I know, but I've been into a few of them, was that St George dressing room on that occasion. But to come to 2001, I had that, and then in 97, I got quite a razz from the crowd because Newcastle was in the grand final, and BHP had ended its steel-making at Newcastle a few months earlier, and I was, of course, to blame for that. And the Newcastle crowd responded accordingly. But when I walked on the field to present the trophy in 2001, there was hardly a boo. I don't think there was. In fact, there were a few subdued cheers, and I thought to myself, this from a rugby league grand final crowd must have meant something. And to the extent that these anecdotal experiences mean anything, and I actually think they do, because I can think of various incidents far less agreeable than this one, where really an Australian sporting crowd has in a certain way has expressed the feeling of the community. And I think therefore I don't know who the clever Prime Minister of Australia was that decided, if the opportunity was ever available to him, not to present the trophy at what was then the VFL grand final. It was never something that Prime Ministers seemed to do in my time. I think they were probably quite sensible. But I do think that 2001, that Aston by-election, signified something. I've often asked, why do you think you stayed in office for a long time? And there's no simple explanation for that. But I do think that one of the real ingredients of the government's success was that we did, I know it sounds a dull way of putting it, but we did play by the rules of our version of the Westminster system to a large degree, not to a complete degree. I think we did run a fairly effective cabinet system of government. None of the really major decisions of the government were the result of any kind of prime ministerial or very senior minister ambush. Sure, I unilaterally indicated on the 12th of September that Australia would stand by the United States in responding to the terrorist attack, but that was something I knew I had implied authority to do, and I knew that my cabinet and my parliamentary party would back me. But I did work very hard at consulting the cabinet. I did learn from the experience of being in the Fraser government. I don't wish to be too critical, but the Fraser cabinet met too frequently. There were too many meetings, and as a result, we were buried under paper and people became a bit exhausted and we had to cancel commitments. And there's nothing more chaotic in a way than a minister having to cancel a commitment that might involve 300 or 400 people in a regional area of Queensland or somewhere. It doesn't really make for good government. And I think that was one of the things that did help treating the cabinet with respect. We had remarkably few leaks from the cabinet, and I think that was a reason, once again, for that circumstance. Quite a lot has been said about my private office, and that is understandable. And I think the observations that were made about my private office by Professor Tiernan I agreed with. I think they were accurate. I was very fortunate in having in both Arthur Sinodinos and then in the last year Tony Nutt as Chief of Staff, but Arthur and Tony were a good duo because Arthur was the economist, Arthur was from the public service, but he'd acquired a great taste for politics, and Tony knew where all the Liberal bodies were buried, and he perhaps had presided at some of those ceremonies, and he also, of course, had a great understanding of parliamentary procedure so that if people got into trouble, and they often did, he was able to help. And of course, from way back in opposition and always available to me to give advice to this day, of course, was my dear friend Graham Morris, who was my initial Chief of Staff, and we had something of a diarchy with him and Nicole Feely and other members of my staff, Jerry and Anthony Bencher and many others who have contributed today. But one of the reasons why I think my office worked fairly well was that there was a requirement to treat the public service, to treat my department politely and professionally. I tried, I hope I didn't fall down on this too often, I tried to practice the view that if you didn't agree with advice you had from the public service, you said why you didn't agree with it. Now, the reality is, Peter and anybody else who's been in government will know, is that 90% of what comes across your desk from the public service is absolutely spot on and should be immediately accepted without argument and shouldn't be allowed to pile up on your desk, because otherwise the routine becomes urgent and then that becomes a crisis, and you have too many of them naturally occurring without generating them by inactivity. So I think that was something that worked well. I'm very grateful that Professor pointed out the importance of the Cabinet Policy Unit. It was, I think, a great innovation, and I had in it three people, entirely different. I had Michael Lestrange, who was one of my closest advisors at a bureaucratic political level. He ended up, of course, as High Commissioner in London and later as Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And then Paul McClintock, who coincidentally had been, he wasn't called a Chief of Staff then, but my principal private secretary when I was first a minister in the Fraser government way back in the 70s. And I'd first been impressed with him when he ran the Sydney University Liberal Club in the early to mid-1970s. And this was at the height of the fury over the Vietnam War, and anybody who was willing to be in the Sydney University Liberal Club, not only to lead at that particular time, won my undying admiration. So I was very, very happy. So I think there's some of the observations I'd make. Now, can I just for a moment, I found Sean Carney's recall of the waterfront dispute fascinating. There was just, except for one issue, which I'll come to in a moment, I thought what he said was both very fair and balanced and very thoughtful and also very accurate. It was something that I believed in very strongly. It was something that I believe Peter Reith believed in very strongly, and he was well advised at some of the seminal moments by Peter Shergold. I have enormous admiration for Chris Corrigan. I don't think Chris Corrigan, Rodney Cavalier pointed that out, I don't think Chris Corrigan was a lifelong Liberal voter at all. He came out of BT, and I think Chris Corrigan probably would have been quite an admirer of some of Paul Keating's financial reforms. But he was prepared to put his hand up and do something that a lot of people in the business community had told me over the years had to be done. But of course, as so often is the case, it was somebody else who had to do it. And you couldn't implement a change of this magnitude without the commitment of somebody in the business community, and Corrigan was extremely courageous. Now, was it a win, a loss or a draw? Well, it certainly wasn't a loss, and I really do stand by what I said in my autobiography, that the boost to productivity as a result of what I regarded as an ingenious decision by the High Court, which essentially, as I recall it, found for the freedom of association conclusions of the federal court, but said it was quite unrealistic in practical economic terms to require the re-engagement of the entire dismissed Patrick workforce, and only half of them go back, and of course, and plus the management prerogatives. It is true that the union monopoly on the waterfront was not broken, but it's certainly true that the unimaginable container movements of 25 to 27 an hour were achieved as a result of the reforms when we were running at about 17 or 18, which of course produced that wonderful story that, ironically enough, Charlie Fitzgibbon, the former Federal Secretary of the Waterside Workers Union, told at the Economic Summit, where he said there was a dear old lady in Innisfail in Queensland, and a policeman knocked on the door and said, "You'll have to take care of yourself because there's a cyclone coming." And she said, "Oh, don't worry, officer, the wharfies won't land it." And such was the mindset of people in our country about the attitude of people to the waterfront. But the one area where I'd respectfully disagree with Sean is it didn't really affect our thinking on work choices. There was a gap of 6 years. I'll make an observation about work choices. Forgive me, Tom, for jumping ahead. I think the big mistake about work choices was getting rid of the no disadvantage test. Now, I know we tried to repair it later on, but that almost emphasised, put up in neon lights, the error that had been made. But you know, that's having the benefit of hindsight. Peter Costello was absolutely right this morning in making the point that the foundation of so much of what we did was, of course, made possible by the decision of the government right at the beginning to get back to balance as soon as possible. That, of course, enabled us to do things in 2001 that required money. And of course we spent some money, but it is money, of course, that was given back to people who contributed to it in the first place. I always found it rather odd after we went out of government that people attacked us for giving tax cuts, particularly the tax cuts on the eve of the election and in the final budget. I mean, we were in surplus. We provided for defence and social security and education. Why wouldn't you give the surplus above and beyond that back in tax cuts. And this idea that we should have had an even bigger surplus, from my recollection, the Treasury wasn't telling us to do that, the Reserve Bank wasn't telling us to do that, and people at the time weren't telling us to do that. I think we would have been regarded as really mean and tricky if we had decided out of the proceeds of this. And as Peter quite rightly reminded all of you this morning, that we were in a healthy financial position before the real proceeds of the China boom began to arrive. It was in the first half of 2001, the full effect of the China boom had not begun to arrive. The contribution on minor parties was very, very interesting. I just put this gloss on it. The difference between the Greens and the Democrats, which is very important in a context I'll come to in a moment, is best explained by the fact that the Greens are, much and all as I oppose them, and I regard them as the real extremists of Australian politics, the Greens are an authentic radical political movement. Some of them are even more radical than others, but they are an authentic radical movement. Whereas the Democrats were not really, I mean, I remember when the Democrats were formed. The Democrats was largely formed by Don Chipp. And not, I don't think I'm exaggerating and being unfair to say it had a lot to do with his frustration at being left out of the cabinet after the election victory in 1975. And it did at the beginning represent as much as anything, a personal splintering away from the Liberal Party at the time. And this is 1977. I mean, in the 1977 election, the Democrats polled extremely well, but they never represented quite the authentic radical movement that the Greens did. And one of the things where I have always said that has made Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull's job much harder than mine was in the Senate is that if you look at the spectrum like this, and this is the Labor Party and this is us, the Democrats were here. They were closer to Labor than to us, but they're between us, whereas the Greens are over there. And we could negotiate with the Democrats, and it's been canvassed this morning. Peter Reith did it very successfully with Cheryl Curnow, and we had the negotiation with Meg Lees, and we were left with no alternative. The alternative, after Brian Harradine said, "I cannot," was either negotiate what we ultimately did or forget about tax reform. I couldn't see the wisdom of having yet another election. Forward on whether you'd have a GST on food. Well, that would have been really clever. I don't think that would have been a very bright idea at all. Now, mistakes. The Wick decision caused me a lot of trouble, and I think more than anything else, the way in which we reacted to the Wick decision in the first part of 1997 slowed the momentum of the government. The Wick decision was unexpected, and the unexpected part about it was that it questioned one of the assumptions of the Native Title Act. There was a recital in Keating's Native Title Act which effectively said that the grant of a pastoral lease extinguished native title. And the Wick decision effectively said, no, that was not right. It did say that a native title and pastoral leases could theoretically coexist to the extent that there was no extinguishment of native title. And it really did unnerve many elements of the coalition, and this had come on top of what Paul Davey and others have referred to, the difficulties of the National Party with gun reform and other issues, and the long delay about whether or not we were going to do something to limit the value of the diesel fuel rebate. Now, that was, and I think the mistake that I accept a large share of the responsibility for this because I involved myself in the negotiation, was we took too long to work out the 10-point plan. And there was a sense created that the government was not only drifting on how we were responding to the WIC decision and how we were handling native title, but there was a feeling that there was a lot of internal division on the issue. And I think that that particular issue did us quite a bit of harm. And of course, by the middle of 1997, we'd fallen behind in opinion polls. And of course, you then had the defection of Cheryl Curnow to the Labor Party. And then, of course, on top of that, we had the ongoing saga of One Nation. Now, I've spent a lot of time in other fora talking about One Nation. My view is that One Nation did us a lot of damage in 1998. I think there's a plausible argument that One Nation did us as much damage politically in 1998 as the GST. Now, Murray Goot's analysis I always respect and follow very, very, very carefully. The truth is that, 60 to 70% of One Nation voters had supported the coalition in 1996. Now, I always think of the person I called Gladesville Man, and Gladesville's a suburb in my electorate, in my autobiography. And here was a man handing out One Nation tickets at the Gladesville Public School. He gave me one as I walked in to vote, and he said, "John, I hope you get re-elected. You have done a wonderful job. You know, I've lived in Gladesville all my life, and you know, da-da-da-da-dum." And I said, "Well, that's fantastic. What's this?" And he said, "Oh, well, look, I like a lot of the things she says." And I said, "Nah." And I said, "Well, if you like me so much, why don't you vote for me?" And he said, "Oh, well, I like it. I want to give her a bit of encouragement." And then I said, "Well, at least you should give me your preference." And he looked at me, and I knew he wasn't going to do so, because what she had recommended was that her preferred position, as I remember, Murray, was that she recommended that One Nation preference against sitting members. Now, by definition, that hurt us a lot more than Labor, because we held all the marginal seats because we'd won so heavily in 1996. And I think they hurt us badly. I think the shock loss of a couple of seats in Western Australia in particular were a product of One Nation. I mean, we were going to lose some of those miracle wins in 1996, particularly in Swan and Rudd seats. Remember, Rudd contested Griffith in 1996 and didn't win it, and he won it in 98. And and Wayne Swan lost his seat and then won it back, the seat of Lilly, I think it is, in 98. So I think One Nation did us quite a lot of damage in that election. And I think it was that phenomenon, yes, 60, 70% had given their first preference to us, but we only got 52 or 53% of their preferences back. Okay. So that's my observation about One Nation. The issue of ministerial standards, I think, was a very fair presentation. I didn't agree with a lot of it, but it's something that is consistent with and explicable. It's a very difficult area. Some people say that the only true Westminster principle is that a minister must go if his or her continued presence is damaging the government. In retrospect, I think my ministerial code had what many people would now see, and perhaps did at the time, as a very unfair impact on Jim Short and Brian Gibson. I think Jim owned a small parcel of shares in the ANZ Bank and unconsciously, as part of his job, approved something that helped the ANZ Bank. The idea that he got any financial gain out of that, of the idea that his small holding of ANZ shares had, and it was something very similar for Brian. On the other hand, some of the other issues were more difficult, and I think the departure of ministers was understandable, and I don't, for personal reasons, I don't want to start going into the entrails of it after all these years, but you do have a very difficult balance judgment to make. And there is an argument that unless there is clear evidence of personal turpitude or dishonesty or financial gain, that the judgment that should exceed all other judgments, apart from, of course, somebody who's misled the Parliament, and that is absolutely never to be approved, the only judgment can be what some people see as the true Westminster principle of damage to the government. Finally, can I say that an asset that my government had throughout its time was that we did have very good teamwork. And I know it sounds it's a corny thing to say, but I really mean it. I did have some extremely capable ministers, and they were prepared to do things. Whenever I'm asked to make a speech about political leadership, the first thing I say that you need to have as a successful political leader is to believe in something. And I had a group of men and women who did believe in something. You had to really believe in industrial relations reform to undertake waterfront reform. You had to believe in taxation reform. And I am indebted to Peter Shergold for reminding me of the magnitude and scale of the privatisation of the employment services. That was a world first. And the scope of that reform was enormous. And in that context, can I say that I was very grateful for the quality of the two men who were secretaries of my department in the time I was Prime Minister. Both very different. Max Moore-Wilton, who was very much the change agent, who is of a more overt, robust kind. Peter Shergold, who was the consummate policy wonk, networker. I mean, Peter's passion for policy was just terrific. I remember on one occasion we were on the VIP flying from somewhere to somewhere overseas, and I wandered out into where Peter and I think Tony Nutt or Arthur or Michael Lestrange were, and I said, "What are you reading, Peter?" "Oh," he says, "this tremendous study from some university about the attitude of the British working class to the benefits provided to recently arrived Bangladeshi immigrants." He said, "It's absolutely fascinating," he said. You know, and you know, and I it's so fascinated him, but his explanation fascinated me because I still remember what it was about. But see, this and I'd reached that stage in my term of government where we wanted more of that. We wanted more policy, and one of the great things that I did receive from my department were policy ideas. And one of the things that I learnt from my period in government from the mid-70s to the early 1980s, of course, was that it's never a good idea for the Prime Minister's department to try and shadow every other department. I think it's a very good idea to let ministers run their departments, and I'm grateful that David Kemp, as a former minister of mine, volunteered that view. I think that helped enormously. But, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, and finally to you, Tom, and to Andrew and everybody else This has been a wonderful couple of days. I've learnt a lot, I've been reminded of a lot, and I hope that the one next year proves to be just as successful. Thank you.